Well, hello and welcome to everyone who's joining us today. Welcome to a new webinar series titled Doing Academia Differently in Conversation with Neuroatypicality. This is a new webinar series and it follows on from the previous 14 webinars that was titled Post-Philosophies in the Doing of Inquiry. This new webinar series is a trilateral partnership between 3 universities. So it's hosted by Vivienne Bozalek from the University of Western Cape, from Geert Van Hove from Ghent University, and myself, Candace Kuby from the University of Missouri. Nikki Romano is the support and go-to person in the series, and so you also see her on the screen today. This free webinar series is going to have a total of 10 sessions. We'll meet monthly on the topic of doing academia differently through conversations with neuroatypicality. Each session involves 1 or 2 international guests who have had some experience with neuroatypicality in the context of higher education. This webinar series is made possible by a research collaborative partnership between the University of Missouri System, the University of Ghent in Belgium, and the University of the Western Cape, or UWC, in Cape Town, South Africa. The partnership between the UM and UWC campuses started in 1986. And the University of Ghent have had a partnership with UWC and the University of Missouri for more than 20 years. This tri-continental partnership is a trilateral agreement between our 3 universities, which sets up funds to promote partnership between our institutions. The funds were provided to support the virtual research and teaching collaborations between faculty members at all of our institutions, and we're so grateful for the long-time collaboration and then the support for this particular webinar series. These webinars are also going to be available on YouTube. So after today's session, the recording will be made public on YouTube for others to access. Also on YouTube, you can select an option for closed captioning to see the written transcript of the webinar. Today, our panelist is Erin Manning, and if you followed our last webinar series, Erin was a guest for that, and we're also glad that you've accepted the invitation to join us for this new webinar series. So Erin, if you'd love to unmute and say a brief hello, we'll introduce you a little more fully a little bit later on, but wanted to give you a chance to say hi to those who are joining.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. I guess I can't see who else is here, but whoever you are, it's great to have you in this conversation.
Thanks so much, Erin. Viv, would you like to?
I'd like to just introduce Nikki Romano, who you can see in the little box. Nikki is a PhD student at the University of the Western Cape, and she's also doing her PhD through Utrecht University, so a joint degree. And she's a lecturer in art history at the Cape Peninsula University of Technology. Nikki is an artist and an art educator with experience in teaching in a variety of sectors. She's going to be providing the technical support on the webinar platform, and she's also going to be assisting us with moderating questions and discussions that we're going to be having after Erin and I have had a talk. And I also wanted to thank Nikki for letting us use one of her artworks in the promotion of the series. Thanks, Nikki.
Thanks, Viv. And now to introduce our 3 co-hosts. Candace Kuby is a professor of learning, teaching and curriculum at the University of Missouri, where she's department chair and the director of qualitative inquiry. Her research interests include the coming to be of literacies when young children work with artistic and digital tools, and approaches to and pedagogies of qualitative inquiry when thinking with post-structuralism and post-human philosophies. She's the co-author of several books, including Speculative Pedagogies of Qualitative Inquiry, Posthumanism and Literacy Education, Knowing, Becoming, Doing Literacies, and Disrupting Qualitative Inquiry, Possibilities and Tensions in Educational Research. Her scholarship appears in several journals, including Qualitative Inquiry, the International Journal of Qualitative Studies in Education, the Journal of Early Childhood Literacy, and the Journal of Literacy Research. Geert Van Hove is a professor in disability studies at Ghent University. His field of research is disability studies and inclusive education. From 2013 to 2018, he was the disability studies professor of the endowed chair of disability studies at VUMC Amsterdam in the Department of Medical Humanities. In 2017, he was the recipient of the Stephen Taylor Memorial Senior Scholar Award at the Disability Studies in Education Conference in Minneapolis. Vivienne Bozalek is an emerita professor in Women and Gender Studies at the University of the Western Cape and honorary professor in the Center for Higher Education, Research, Teaching and Learning at Rhodes University. She has a PhD from Utrecht University, and her research interests and publications include the political ethics of care and social justice, posthumanism and feminist new materialisms, innovative scholarly practices in higher education, and post-qualitative and participatory methodologies. Her most recent co-edited books of 2021 include Posthuman and Political Care Ethics for Reconfiguring Higher Education, Post-Anthropocentric Social Work, Critical Posthumanism and New Materialist Perspectives, and Higher Education Hauntologies, Living with Ghosts for a Justice to Come. Thanks, Viv.
Thanks, Nikki. So just a little bit of an overview of our webinar today, and then Viv's going to get us started into some conversation with Erin. So we are using the Zoom webinar platform. And at this time, the host and panelists have access to audio and video function. But what we're hoping to try out this time is when we get to the Q&A portion a little bit later, is to perhaps promote our attendees into panelists so that they're able to have the audio and video function. I know this was something that was requested as we moved through our last webinar series. So we're going to try it out today. This is our first time to do that. And so if you'll be patient and flexible with us as we move into our Q&A time. As I mentioned before, we are recording this webinar for public viewing on YouTube later. So when we do give the option for people to move into a panelist role for the Q&A, if you'd like to keep your video off, please know that you have that option. The chat function is open for you to connect with other attendees throughout the entire webinar. So if you would prefer to write rather than ask a question verbally, you can do that in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. I will be moderating the Q&A time. And so if you put your question in the Q&A box, that will make it a little easier than trying to scroll through the whole chat box to find the questions that are there. So the structure for the webinar is as follows. For the first 30 or 40 minutes, Viv will interview Erin on the 4 main questions, which is a common thread for all of the webinars in this series. You can find these questions on the webinar webpage. While discussing these questions, Erin will share examples from her scholarship as well as her experiences, and also their suggested readings that are posted on the website. Finally, we'll open up this space for all attendees who might want to be in conversation with Erin to hopefully be promoted to a panelist with video and audio functions, and we'll engage in a dialogue with your questions. We hope to have for about 30 minutes to do that. So we suggest that you jot down any questions or comments that arise throughout the webinar. Feel free to go ahead and type them in the Q&A button whenever they come to mind, and we'll get to those toward the end today. So Viv, if you're ready.
Thanks very much, Candace, for that introduction. And I'm delighted that, Erin, you've agreed to come yet again to our webinar series. So we remember your previous one very well, and we really enjoyed it. We're so inspired by your work, especially your work on neuroatypicality, and I'll be asking you about it shortly. But I just wanted to introduce you briefly. Erin Manning studies in the interstices of philosophy, aesthetics, and politics, concerned always about alter-pedagogical and alter-economic practices. 3E is the direction her current research takes, an exploration of the transversality of the 3 ecologies, the social, the environmental, and the conceptual. An iteration of 3E is a land-based project north of Montreal, where living and learning is explored. And that has legacies of Sense Lab, which infused the project, particularly the question of how collectivity is crafted in a more than human encounter with worlds in the making. Sounds fascinating. It would be also good to hear a little bit about that. But Erin, our first question, and it's an apt question because somebody on Facebook said to me, why are you using the word neuroatypicality? Why not neurodiversity? So I wanted to ask you, because I first learned about it from you, what does this word neuroatypicality mean, first of all? And yeah, how does it relate to neurodiversity?
It's great to be back in this conversation, and it's great to be here. It's just heartwarming to know these are questions that are important to some people as our universities return to status quo. I'm a little bit uncomfortable with the vocabulary of neuroatypicality, and I'll tell you why. And I guess I should say that this is in no sense a resolved question. You'll hear in the environment of neurodiversity, probably the most common term is neurodivergence, which I also don't use. And my reasons are more philosophical, perhaps, than anything else. What I'm concerned about when we speak about neuroatypicality or neurodivergence is that we take neurotypicality as a person. And I've worked really hard to try to articulate that neurotypicality is not something someone is. It's a systemic baseline according to which modes of self-presentation and modes of knowing are policed. Now, the trouble with saying that is that people can think that what I'm saying is that that neurodiversity is just a spectrum of difference, as though there's no singularity of difference within that spectrum. And that's also not what I'm saying. That neurodiversity is, yes, a spectrum, but there are neurodiversities that are singular. And we have to attend to that singularity. So what I'm wanting to say is that it's not going to be helpful for us to generalize too much around these conversations. We're going to have to, in each case, think about the singularities and the necessities those singularities bring forth. So yes, of course, there's atypicality, but there's only atypicality in my view. So then the question would be, to what degree then the neuro is necessary? And I'm sorry, it's sort of a long answer, but I think it's sort of politically an important long answer, because the neuro is perhaps where we want to stay the least amount of time. I've been asked many times over the years, why hold on to the neuro in neurodiversity? And the only reason I think to hold on to it is to again attend to the singularity of that difference, but not to have a long conversation on the brain. I think that will again lead us into a place that is just not helpful, and I'm happy to talk about that more in great detail. But I'm wanting to say, you know, there is a moment, a really, really key moment, where activists come together and talk about neurodiversity as a moment to attend to. There's a moment where people are saying we need care, we need facilitation, we need difference, but we don't need cure. And I think we're still in a time when that moment needs to be addressed. From there, you know, the vocabulary of disability studies is the vocabulary that should take us where we need to go, because that's a vocabulary that has a long history of dealing with the problem of the social versus the problem of the personal, and we need to learn from that movement, I think. So that's why I say that neurodiversity is about diversity in diversity, rather than about a binary. So that's my rant. Sorry, that was long.
Yeah. No, it's helpful. I also wanted to know now, where does MAD studies, you know, because some of the people that we've asked to come onto the series are they would see themselves part of MAD studies. How do you relate to that, and where does it fit in then to all these things?
You know, it's fascinating to me. I'm not so good at categories, and I kind of come to things backwards. If I had known there was something like MAD studies, it would have changed my life 20 years ago, having spent time in psychiatric institutions. But I didn't know about MAD studies. So like so many people who have struggled, I hid. It's exciting to know that hiding is less necessary. To what degree it's necessary is still a question, though, and I could talk about that more. The dangers are real, I think. But I find it most exciting for people to invent all of the modes that are necessary. Then that's more important to me than segregating modes. You know, I think categories are only useful as long as they're useful. You know, so if MAD studies is exciting now, I'm all for it. And probably my favorite term is the one used by Felix Guattari, which is normopathy. I love normopathy. I mean, how great is that? You know?
That's, I also like it, I must say. And you use it quite a lot in your work. So just getting back onto how these relate to higher education, where we located, and you know, what does it mean then for higher education?
Mm-hmm. I guess it means everything. You know, I entered into this very intuitively. It took me really almost 20 years to realize I was neurodiverse. That's not what moved me into the question. What moved me into the question was autistic reading my work and me trying to understand what it was about work on movement that moved them into conversation with me. And then being in a classroom in the context of studio art, I realized that I was dealing with a majority of students who would, in some other context, probably be identified as having learning disabilities. And yet, obviously, this didn't feel like a negative thing. They felt very creative, very, very full of potential. But I could see that in the classroom, they held a lot of shame. And this would often sediment itself around suggestions that they read philosophy. And so I realized quite quickly that there was a sense in the classroom that people weren't smart. I mean, people thought of themselves as not smart. And that became a big conversation for me with them about, you know, first of all, that was not the case, but also where were we failing each other? How could we situate learning in a way that this wouldn't be the tendency that people wouldn't feel when given a philosophic text that they were not capable of reading it. And so more and more what today I would call accommodations were set into play, but at the time I didn't think of them as accommodations. I just thought of them as challenges as a teacher to learn otherwise. And then as my work moved more and more into the environment of questions concerning race, I began to realize that this was inextricable from the question of racialization. So what is presumed as knowledge and what is presumed as competence, and what are the conditions under which learning happens, and how many of those conditions are predicated on whiteness, and how do we understand neurotypicality and whiteness as conjoined. So for me, those are higher education questions at the core, because it seems to me that higher education is predicated on value systems that are both white and neurotypical.
Yeah.
which is to say ableist, you know, and following that line.
And probably middle class too, and all sorts of other things. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So you spoke about accommodating, but I mean, it's, you know, what you did with accommodating is probably a different way of doing pedagogy, a different way of doing research, which I'm sure you've developed quite a lot along the way. So maybe you could talk a little bit about, you know, how exactly you did it. I mean, there are things like multimodality, for example, you know, not foregrounding language, which I think you also talk about in your ticking flapping chapter.
In thinking about accommodation, I've been very influenced in recent times by the deaf-blind poet and scholar John Lee Clark. And John and I have become quite close, and I just love what he says about accommodation, that it always carries this kind of presupposition that other ways don't exist, you know, and so you're always returning to the status quo in order to foreground the most impoverished forms of engagement, which is not to say it's not necessary, but he's very clear on how we shouldn't think of it as enlightening. Communities have always had forms of engagement, right? And so really, I think, you know, I come from a family of educators. I've never written about this, but I come from a family of really imaginative people. And my father was an English teacher in high school, and he worked in an environment with kids who would be on the farm in the spring. And in the Canadian scholarly year, we go from September to June. So that means that the kids were often out planting in the spring and out of class. And my father realized that what happened was that the boys in particular would miss school, and then they would be set back, and so they would get older, and then they would be situated as bullies in the classroom. People would think of them as bullies, but actually what had happened is that they hadn't achieved literacy. They weren't learning to read and write. And so in the late 70s and 80s, my father would he started giving them modes of self-recording, Walkmans, and invited them to speak. And I grew up around that, and it wasn't considered particularly strange that you would find ways to get people invested, you know? And I think that that's all I did. So I just as an example, I understood quite quickly that students, given requirements to prove their value, would stop learning. So if we give a student an essay that's due, say, on April 15th, they've stopped learning around March 15th. Because by March 15th, their whole attention is toward the April 15th deadline. Similarly for the critique in the studio art context. So I started thinking, well, so I'm here teaching them, but they can't learn anymore. So what can I do to keep them with me? And I realized I had to get rid of that April 15th deadline. It just wasn't working for us. So pretty quickly, I stopped with any end of term deadlines. And I experimented with all kinds of ways to bring that work into the classroom, literally. I'll just give you one example, which I'm going to redo this year. I do a different class every time I teach, so I'm always reinventing, and really, truly, so many of them are failures because, you know, we're trying to figure it out together. But one of them that worked well was pairing students in threesomes. So you can't pair in a threesome, I know, but I don't know how else to put it. Threeing students, where each student took a name out of a hat at the first class, and their challenge over the term was to give the person whose name they took out of the hat their process. So your task was to give back the process to the person whose name you've taken out of the hat. In the meantime, we're doing the reading and the work that we do in the class. But that particular technique was very rich because there was a sense of real care. So in some cases, it meant that people would babysit, or they would go to the person's house and wash their dishes, or they would record their practices, or they would listen to their writing, or they would build them something that allowed their work to happen. And I realized that there was such excitement in facilitating someone else's process. And of course, in that context, someone else was facilitating their process. And what I found, for example, in an example like that, is that in that context, totally naturally, people use the forms of learning that are most generative for them. So in that context, if photography is your way of learning, you use photography, or if writing is your way of learning, you use writing, and so on. So that would just be one example.
So did they just share with each other, or did they share with you, and were there sort of grades attached to it? Because, you know, it's often easy to sort of do things differently, but when it comes to assessment, it's a little bit more difficult, I think.
Yeah, so in that context, we had a party at the end where everybody shared their gifts, because the assessment was the gift that you gave to the other person. So it was a bit like Christmas, you know, everybody had their gifts and we opened one gift at a time, and the assessment was based on doing the work. And so what I do is I always have the assessment based on doing the work. You know, there's been pushback, of course, but I can tell you that in the classrooms where I teach, the students do outstanding work. So whenever there's been pushback, I've been able to show the work, and there's no question that it's outstanding. And I think that, so the question of assessment is a really complicated one. I studied in Berlin, where there was no evaluation that was formalized in that way. We simply received pass or fail, and it was only on the basis of attendance, which I think is a better system personally. But I figured that if you, I mean, we'd have to check this out, but if you, in a classroom, decide that you're assessing people on the basis of their participation, which is not to say their presence, their participation, which is to say their own decision to commit, you'll probably give 10% of people a free grade, I guess. So 10% of people won't show up, or 10% of people won't do the work. But I don't see that that's a big deal. Right? I mean, what is that 10%? And in my experience, those students have often returned to me in the future and have given me something, a text, a poem, an artwork. They have done the work. They've just done it on another timeline. And they've often asked me why it was that they weren't penalized. And my answer has been that it wasn't clear to me that they weren't doing any work. I wasn't sure how that could be assessed. So I have a tendency to believe that we have to, if we want to shift the conditions of value, we have to be less sure we know what they are.
Yeah, your book says a lot about that for Pragmatics of the Useless. So, I mean, maybe you could talk a little bit about, you know, the outsider valuing something, and, you know, what is a Pragmatics of the Useless, and how does it work, both in terms of research, you know, research creation, and in terms of pedagogy?
So I think of the pragmatics of the useless as this uneasy interstice where value hasn't yet shaped the event. So valuation is an emergent process for me, happens all the time. Happens in the minute where you open your mouth and you put a bite of food in it and you go, blah. That's valuation, right? An infant knows how to value, right? But the problem I have is not there, is with this presupposition that we know in advance what has value. And that where value becomes so endemic that we don't even know we're valuing anymore. And that's, to me, whiteness or neurotypicality. So for me, and so the opposite for me of a pragmatics of the useless is a representation of the useful. So there's no pragmatics of the useful, because the useful is simply a category, and it's usually something that has very little effort involved in it, except to police it, to make sure it stays the same. So one of the things that I've noticed from a pedagogical perspective is that, I might be in a classroom and somebody's not paying attention. Paying attention is a key thing for me. It's been very important for me as a teacher to hone my own, to explore my own discomfort around the question of attention, and to not penalize for what can be perceived as a lack of attention. And I've written a lot about that. But when say I leave a classroom and I might have in my head, that person wasn't paying attention. What were they doing? Were they just on Facebook the whole time I was teaching? And I'm really aware that it's my ego speaking, right? Like I wasn't like, what? I'm not the center of your attention. I'm not that important. And those are moments that I'm really interested in, because I'm trained to have the feeling that I should be important right now, that what I say should have importance. And why should it have importance? Why should it have more importance than another moment? So for pragmatics of the useless is that place of discomfort, which is unresolved. I still leave the class sometimes with that feeling. Of course I do, but I want to be in an environment of learning. And in order to be in that environment of learning, there has to be, I think, the uneasiness around not knowing what is valuable, and really, for me, the question that is really at the core there is the question of practice. So to be in the practice of learning, in the unease of it, in the discomfort of it, and to recognize that discomfort has a lot to do with not being able to assess the parameters of where knowing happens and where it doesn't happen, and to become more and more curious about that uneasiness.
Yeah. I should imagine that it's easier to do that in something like research creation than it is in a sort of formal curriculum in the university. Hi. I see your cat.
I have a beautiful deaf cat here. He's always very curious about what these mouths are all doing.
So
yeah, I think you're absolutely right that it isn't every environment that facilitates these modes of learning. But I think at the same time, we have to be careful, because it's not because we're in fine arts that there isn't whiteness or neurotypicality. And it's not because we're in disability studies that there isn't that. We have to recognize that these forms of practice are very much how we get our self-esteem in these environments. We learn that we're good students because we recognize what already has value. And when I say to a good student, I was a good student. When I say to a good student, these are not the forms of learning that we're going to be necessarily privileging. Often they're very, very anguished. And this is also something I think we have to deal with, that if I'm going to take the rug out from under you, how am I going to protect you? What am I going to set up that's going to make it okay in the other classroom, for example, where the modes of learning are really normative, you know, and it's an unresolvable question, and it keeps me up at night.
I think it's an important one, because it could also be a little bit confusing. And I suppose one can't also protect people from, you know, what's going on in other classrooms. I'm going to move on to the question about an alternative politico-ethical onto epistemology. And I know you've written a lot about neurodiversity and blackness, and you've even equated neurotypicality with institutional racism. So, you know, you could say a little about that, and maybe how does it intersect with decolonial and post-colonial debates in higher education, which is of a lot of interest for us, specifically in South Africa, but I think, you know, across the world too.
Yeah, so what I tried to propose in For Pragmatics of the Useless was a logic of approximation of proximity. I begin there because the most dangerous way of talking about this is in a simple causal scenario, where you might think I'm saying that all Black people are autistic, because I'm saying Black life is neurodiverse life. I'm not saying Black people are autistic. I'm saying that neurotypicality as a mode of knowing and sensing that is systemic, that is akin to whiteness, is not given to Black folks. It's not given to Blackness. It's not given to Indigenous folks. They are already excluded. It's not given to folks with disabilities. If your body is such that it reveals its diversity, for example, through a spasticity, or through not holding your head up, or through having the physiognomy of several genetic diseases, you are immediately treated as stupid, immediately, right? So we've internalized this idea that a smart body is a body that holds its head up, that can look you in the eye, that is able in every reference, and that includes racialized reference. And you know, this was not totally clear to me until I was in conversation with Fred Moten about it, when he said to me, yes, Erin, but neurodiverse life is Black life. And when Fred Moten says that, he is making a difference between Black people and Black life. And this is always something that is important to say. He's saying that there's a quality of Blackness that transverses Black people. And this quality of Blackness, which is of them but can't be reduced to them, is in excess of anything like a human. It's a quality of existence that has been honed and practiced. And this is where I'm situating this approximation of proximity, where I'm saying that what happens in existence is that the policing of that difference is the acute, it is the way, it's hard to think when you have a white cat jumping on you. It is the way that the individual is defined. And what I mean by that is very close to what Saidiya Hartman speaks about when she talks about the burdened individuality of freedom. When Saidiya Hartman in Scenes of Subjection talks about slavery and talks about Blackness and talks about practice, she's talking about the entry into neoliberalism, the entry into capital as a burdened individuality, which is by its very necessity exclusive, and it is excluding of Blackness, which doesn't mean that a few Black people can't be in some way connected to it, but their Blackness is excluded from it. right? And that's the really important point, I think, that so many scholars, Tina Kemp, Sean Crawley, so many scholars are trying to articulate in really different and exciting ways. And so the decolonial, which is at the heart of that, in my view, cannot be addressed except through practice. You can't just speak a bit about decolonialism, you have to practice it, which is to say that if you're white, which is not the same thing as whiteness, but is definitely in connection to it and in proximity to it, you have to ask yourself what forms of existence you practice that facilitate the ongoing foregrounding of neurotypicality in the world. And this means you have to attend to capitalism, you have to attend to education, you have to attend to questions of able-bodiedness, you have to attend, and so on. And it's hard work. It's hard work to do that and not make it all about yourself, you know, not start talking about white shame and all of the ways in which we recenter the conversation on whiteness. And so, you know, I'm saying all of that because I have a certain impatience with a kind of status quo that uses all the right vocabulary. It's hard to do this work in the university. And I don't know that it's possible, to be honest with you. I'm discouraged most of the time.
Thanks for that. I was also, while you were talking, thinking about what you've written about neuroatypicality and queerness. I mean, in Jürgen's notion of neuroqueerness being sort of alternative ways of sort of experiencing the world, relating to the world, and probably it's the same for decoloniality, for things like, you know, the sort of undercommons that Merton and Hani are talking about. So maybe I don't want to hog a lot of the time. So just to end off, maybe you could talk about, you know, what sort of ways does neuroatypicality open up for us in higher education? And, you know, how could we respond to that?
Well, to sort of go off the question of queerness, one of the really interesting things about many autistics is that they don't identify with any gender. And so the queerness that Melanie Ergo is talking about is a queerness that is really agendered. And in that sense, it can't be pronounced. And so it leaves you with a world to be invented. What I've found in learning in the context of neurodiversity is that the ground isn't there. You're making it all the time, and you're asking all the time, what are the conditions that will allow it to be made? And these change all the time. You know, they change with everything to do with the world, you know, the anxiety levels as they change, the depression levels as they change, the medications people are on as they change, the gender expression as it changes, and so on. And so for me, at least, it's a question of pedagogically being in conversation or in act all of the time. This week, what is it that is needed? What kinds of practices can we invent together that make the world possible this week? And I think that in a really important way, you know, the world leaders in ecology are neurodiverse. We're going to need to learn from people like Greta Thunberg. We're going to need to learn from people how to do this work of caring for the planet. And I think perhaps as teachers, what we're doing is facilitating that learning more so than leading it.
Yeah, agreed. I was thinking also about philosophically how you bring neuroatypicality into sort of, to augment what you're saying philosophically, like, for example, what you have to say about volition and intentionality and the pre-constituted subject. It sort of makes so much sense, in this, using this as an example to explain it to people. So I've really appreciated that, I must say, in your work. It makes it so comprehensible.
I think that really, I'm saying this not just saying this, but I think that children are our best philosophers. Philosophy has been given bad rap as though it's hard, but philosophy is not hard. It's like a drawing. It's a world that gets made. And I think that our task together might be to allow ourselves the breadth to invent those worlds with the big questions that philosophy allows them to activate, So I've said this before, but when I published Relationscapes and autistics started contacting me, all of the autistics who contacted me were teenagers. All of them had been excluded from education except DJ Savory. So, and it's a book of philosophy. So I don't believe for a second that people have trouble reading philosophy. What I believe is that the education system's normative frameworks makes people so afraid of not knowing that when they read an opening to another world, they panic. And that's what we're seeing, is that panic.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to hand over to the others to open it up to, hopefully we'll be able to see people and for them to ask you questions. I'm sure that there are a lot of people here who would like to be in conversation with you. So I'm going to hand over to Candace and Nikki and Geert.
Thanks so much, Viv and Erin. So we're going to try something new with this webinar series. We're going to try to have all of those who are attendees have the option to become a panelist, which gives them the video and audio function. So I've made Nikki a co-host, and I think we have to go in for each attendee and change their status into panelist. If you don't want to have your video on and you don't want to engage in audio and video, that is totally fine. You don't have to accept that invitation when Nikki pushes the button for you. But what we invite people to do is use the Q&A icon on the bottom of your screen. Type your questions there. You're welcome to go ahead and start typing those now. If you're coming in as a panelist, so to speak, please just make sure your audio is turned off. What I'm going to try to do is read questions from the Q&A box. So if people prefer just to type, they can type. And then I'm going to ask those who want to have audio and video function if they'll use the raise your hand icon on the bottom of the screen. And then I'll try to get to people and try to kind of go back and forth between written questions and those who want to ask them themselves. So I see some people are coming in, and thank you, Nikki, for getting people here with video and audio. So to get us going, I don't see a question typed yet in the Q&A box, but is there somebody here that wants to unmute and ask a question themselves to Erin? I see Susie's hand going up. So Susie, if you want to introduce yourself and ask a question.
Hi, my name's Susie, TA, Taylor Alston, made up name, but anyway. It's really, all I can say is, why haven't I read you yet? So I'm going to go back, I'm going to read you, I'm going to rewatch this recording, and yeah, it's incredible to hear you speak. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Susie. Do we have somebody else that would like to ask a question?
I've noticed, Candace, as I am inviting people to become panelists, they are quickly declining the invitation. It might be a bit scary.
Yes, it's the first time that we've tried this out, and so people might not be comfortable, which is totally fine, but we wanted it to be an option this time. Geert, I see that you've unmuted. Do you have a question that you want to engage with Erin?
Perhaps it helps a bit to massage the group to come to questions and discussion. Erin, I was trying to read the book, and you made a very firm statement saying the university is in ruins. If we look at things that are in ruins, you can see them as beauties of the past, or you can see them as organizations or objects that can be taken over by other ones. How do we go on with this statement? Because it's very clear, your statement, and I can understand why you're saying it. At the same time, we see all kind of capitalist invaders coming in, saying, "Oh, no problem. If it's in ruins, we'll take over." And where do we go from then? So I would like to hear your ideas about what do we do with the ruins of the university.
It's a beautiful question. You know, it's interesting. I'd love to know what you think. It's interesting thinking about our two locations, because I'm quite familiar with the Belgian context. And I would say that probably the Belgian context and the Canadian context are pretty good in the hierarchy of the ruins compared to, say, the Australian context or the UK context. You know, we've seen different just different speeds, I guess you could say. Like, how quickly can neoliberalism take over? How quickly does the administrative class take over the university? The problem is so complicated, and I don't want to be glib about it at all. I think that the danger is that there is too close a connection made between the work we do and the university. The work we do when we do our work, the thinking, the creating conditions to thinking, it needs to continue in every way. And it needs to be free. And in most cases in the world, it's not free. And in most cases in the world, it's not continuing, which is to say that more and more of our colleagues can't teach the work that they need to teach and can't do the thinking that they need to think, because they're being given these very normative, tailored scenarios that sell, right? So I'm writing from a privileged place in the sense that I can teach what I want to teach, and that Quebec has the lowest tuition in North America. So I'm still in the context of a better situation. But even there, the modes of evaluation are killing the students that I teach. Not because they can't necessarily do them, not because it's impossible to write that paper or whatever, but because the anxiety of the world as it stands, the ecological devastation, the neoliberal capitalism that we're living in are so heavy and so overwhelming that there isn't a way to separate, to get it out of our skins, you know, to get it out of our cells. And so it feels like we're not adequately addressing how to teach under those circumstances. And that's not the fault of teachers for the most part. it's a systemic problem of institutional life. So when I went on sabbatical a year ago, the first sabbatical in 18 years, I was so burnt out that opening a book caused nausea for 8 months. It was so strong, you know, and that's somebody who loves to read, you know, so it is in ruins, I think, because it's killing us. It's killing those of us who teach, and it's killing those of us who learn. And somehow, yes, we need to be devising every technique we can think of, because it's not black and white. It's not like you can leave the institution and then you're going to find the perfect context. Obviously, it's like figuring it out, as you say, you know, on the stones, you know, with the termites, as I write, like wherever you can. I don't know if that's a sufficient answer. I feel very hesitant. Maybe you have some wisdom.
Oh no, oh no, oh no. I was just wondering, because it is linked also to the idea you brought, that we have to use schizoanalytic work to survive together with a group of students you work with. And if I understood schizoanalytic work a little bit, I think it means you have to destruct to preserve, or you have to dance with the good things and the evil things together, because they're all there. And I agree with you that in certain environments we are still in a better living with better conditions, and students can survive a little bit. But even in those environments, I think the ableism is so normalized and so there, that it's so difficult to work in freedom, as you were putting on the table. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I could maybe say a little bit about schizoanalysis in that context, because it's such a hard concept. It's in the context in which it was born, in the Laborde clinic that was brought into action by Jean-Henri and Felix Guattari and others. Schizoanalysis was conceived as a mode of encountering the therapeutic that didn't organize itself around transference. So in the typical psychoanalytic model, the transference, which is to say the imposition onto the body of the analyst of the figure of anguish or pain or trauma, is abolished. And when you abolish the figure of transference, what you have is an activation of an environment. And then in that environment, you have to create the conditions for living. And so schizoanalysis asks something very hard, which is here now. How do we create the conditions? One example that I find really helps to imagine it is from Guattari, where he talks about being inside a room with a therapist and a patient. And the patient is looking out the window, and the therapist is asking the patient about their father. And Guattari says, but it was so clear that they needed to leave the room. The patient was already gone. You know, and schizoanalysis is just that. You just walk out and you start doing the work there. But of course, the just walking out is the challenge. Yeah.
Does it also have to do with some form of collectivity? You know, of not individualizing. Could you say a little about that?
Yeah, just a second. I have this problem of a cat who wants to come in. So yeah, I'm just letting the cat in. Yes, so that's really, really important, that Guattari talks about the group subject and the subjected group. And the group subject is more than the sum of its parts. So the group subject is not a bunch of people, individuals. The group subject is that quality of existence that erupts in excess of any one individual. When a classroom's going well, a group subject is formed. You can feel it. Or, you know, when the party moves into the kitchen, a group subject is often formed. The subjected group is the ways in which the forces of subjection, be they neurotypicality, be they whiteness, whatever, ableism, begin to act on the group. So it's close to what Foucault calls a control society, or Deleuze calls a control society. So we move through the world most typically as a subjected group, looking out to police each other, to check each other, you know? And we do that in the practice of this burdened individuality of freedom, you know, in a scarcity of freedom, in a scarcity of potential. And what schizoanalysis does is try to turn that and to become more and more aware of how the subjected group works, and to work within a collectivity, which is not, again, a bunch of people. The collectivity is in the solitary too. It's not reducible to a lot of folks. I mean, to a lot of one plus one plus one plus one. It is in this quality of sociality that you'll hear about a lot in Black studies. It's a sociality that is of the world, you know, that is ecological.
Thanks. It's helpful. Oh, Nikki, are there other questions? Because I thought if they aren't at the moment, I thought of also just asking something about the 3E, and whether I'm just sort of curious about whether it's been set up as another way of learning, as an alternative to university, or what is it and what do you do there?
I wish I could say very clearly. So The Three Ecologies is a beautiful little book by Guattari, written in the late 80s, in the late 70s, early 80s, where Guattari totally presciently says that if we want to deal with the ecological devastation, we're going to have to address the transversality of the environmental, the conceptual, and the social. That we'll never be able to do it by separating these things out. And that, for the past decade or so, we've been thinking a lot about what a Three Ecologies project would be. For a while, we called it a Three Ecologies Institute, but Institute just kept sticking in a way that made us uncomfortable, but we couldn't think of another word. And then I went on sabbatical and project came up, and I was like, yes. So the Three Ecologies project is a proposition for other ways of learning. But we need the world to help us figure out what that means. So we're right at the beginning. We've purchased a large tract of land, which is off-grid, and has 3 houses on it, all of which are trying to work, well, they're solar, but they're trying to figure out environmental conditions in the north of Quebec, which is hard. It includes a maple bush and a sugar shack. It includes one little cabin, which is always free and open for the project work. And the project as a whole, once my partner Brian Masumi and I have paid off the debt, will be given back to the public. So it's a project to take land out of private property. The question of how we learn here is completely connected to what the land asks us to or how the land asks us to learn from it. And so it's really hard for me to say because I've only been here for 7 months. What I can say is that we've been learning a lot about permaculture. And if you don't know about permaculture, I really suggest you go and try to discover it a little bit. It's really a mode of learning that has to do with how nature does its work, and modes of growing and modes of harnessing growth that are that facilitate its own processes rather than implanting monocultures onto the earth. And so what we're thinking is that people will hopefully come either physically or online and teach us or work with us to learn how to learn here. The site is, the reason we bought this particular site is that it is a good site for groups because of it's 100 acres and it has these houses and so on. Things that I can imagine happening include building a greenhouse, working on permaculture, making maple syrup, reading philosophy, foraging, dancing, making art, investing in thought on alter economies, you know, all of that work. But I think it's going to have to just figure itself out. What we've learned over the years is that things just take a certain amount of time, and it's best not to rush them, because when the people arrive, then they are already ready to teach us what we need to learn. So the first thing that I think will happen in terms of learning very specifically, although first things have already happened, of course, is that the protactile community will hopefully, some folks from the protactile community, which is the new language in the deafblind community, will come in the winter, and we'll have some explorations together of language and movement. But yeah, I suppose it's an ongoing call to help us think and learn and move. Yeah.
Thanks for clarifying. Sounds exciting.
I would say one other thing that is maybe important, that it's hard. It's been really hard to try to work in an off-grid setting in the north is hard. You know, there isn't enough sun, and the conditions are wild, and lots of really pragmatic things have to happen, which are often feel neurotypical. Like you have to figure out how to turn on generators if there's not enough solar, or you have to really be aware of how much electricity you're using, and so it's full of questions. But one of the things that John, my deafblind friend, has said to me is, Erin, take heart, because what feels easy about our worlds is learned. And this was a really, really important thing that he said to me. You know, that it might feel easy to work with electricity, but that's because we've worked with electricity in our lives and we've grown up with them. And so working with solar might feel hard, but that's just because it's not a habit. And so I think what also we're looking for are people who are not scared to be in the hard, in the uneasiness, in the fear of the unknown, in the learning, I guess.
Yeah. I can imagine solar in South Africa, but not so much in Canada, I must say. Yeah.
Well, it's just, you know, we're philosophers, Brian and I. I'm an artist, you know, there's no hot water today. Okay, is it because it's cloudy? And where is it coming in? And what are these 3 tanks doing? And which way is on and off? And you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's what it feels like every day, you know? So we took down these trees yesterday because we need the sun at 8 a.m. Now we have these monster trees, but even though I have all the right equipment, I couldn't get this stupid chainsaw working because you need to be really strong to pull it. And how do you do that? And what do you do when, you know, and these are the questions, and they're like really, really pragmatic. And it's been a challenge, also a challenge for our collaborators.
If I could just come in, Judy. Judy has a question. Judy, are you with us?
Yes.
Okay.
I am. I could
We
start
see
with
you,
I
Judy.
I actually
We
don't
can't see
think
you.
Sorry. Oh, there we are. Can you
Hello.
see me?
Hi, Judy.
Hello. Hello to those I know. Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Erin. I must say that, oh, that got me going, that last bit that you were talking about. My heart has just started thumping a bit because I found myself in this absolutely bizarre situation of my own making. But so my husband's a priest, and we have joined a Christian community in North Devon on 280 acres. It's called Lee Abbey, if anyone wants to Google it, just to see what this building that we live in. 280 acres of ancient woodland and farmland. So we live with a beautiful herd of red Devon cattle, and we've got sheep and pigs, all of which we eat. Some of us eat, some of us don't eat. So we share the land with them. I mean, and we are an absolutely motley crew from all over the world. At the moment, Russia, Brazil, Germany, loads of countries, Kazakhstan when we arrived, Canada, lots of countries. Anyway, and I'm wrestling with questions of what on earth I'm sort of doing here. But what struck me, I suppose, Erin, while you're talking, was just the basis of a call, perhaps is the right word, to come to a place, and the parameters of that call, and maybe because it's a term that's being sort of massive, both in church circles and in and secular circles in the UK, is obviously safeguarding. But there are issues of safeguarding, both of animals and plants, and people who have English as a second language, and what makes people feel safe. So we make sort of 3 promises about loyalty within the community. So we are a retreat center and a community, and people come away to retreat. Any people come, but it is a Christian community. So I don't really have a question, except that I suppose over this next year, what I would love is a question that emerges that I can think and write and research around. It's too soon. I haven't got the question. I wanted to start this year, but it's big, and it is incredibly diverse. What I love about it is that it's not a university, it's a multiversity. I really love that.
Yeah.
So I don't want to run away. I mean, part of me wants to run away to a university, but I keep going, stick with it, because I think it's got more potential in some ways. But it's, yeah, it's hard too.
I really appreciate what you're saying, because I think we have, I want to learn more from you about what you've lived so far. It's been quite challenging, as you know, we bought in at the end of last year, and so we've gone through our first winter, and you could die out here. You know, it gets to -30 or more in the winter, and you've got to be able to make a fire, and you've got to be able to you've got to be smart about what you do at night. You know, it's wild. We're at the end of the road in Quebec. Beyond this, it's all Crown land. And I think I have underestimated the skills of the folks that I was close to. But also there's something that I think we need to talk about that may be also generational. I'm not sure, but I have a feeling that has to do with legacy. I think there are a lot of people who are feeling like, what is the world that we leave behind? And how are we creating the conditions for that world where learning can happen, but also where skills are made and where those skills are not that are not contradictory to art or philosophy, but entwined with in that transversality of the three ecologies. How do we set that up in a way that doesn't recreate a kind of useful, useless dichotomy? How do we really take seriously pragmatics of the useless, even while we say you really have to be careful where your feces are in this context because there's flowing water? You know, there's just so many questions, and Brian and I really are confused about where to go. We're having big conversations about it. Because also the other thing is a question of tending. So if we go back to the question of the university is an institution insofar as it has presumably, I mean, this is a big question mark, figured out what its parameters for care and tending are. We know it hasn't figured that out, but it pretends to have figured it out through safe spaces, through classrooms, through value judgments or criteria or blah, 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 all the rest. But when you set out in a context that is not framed, then you have to set up the conditions for, as you say, safety or care or tending. And the thing is that these processes are durational processes. And so if you grow something, you have to stay to pick it. You know, if you kill an animal, we don't hunt on our land, but this is a hunting area, then you have to know how to deal with that animal in a safe and ethical way, and so on and so forth. And so it's hard. And I think also the question, with so many questions, but this question of returning private land to public use, which is happening, I think, all over the world, is also a question. Under what conditions can it be safeguarded? And are there legal loopholes that can loop it back into the private sector? And how do we make sure that doesn't happen? How do we make sure that somebody's criteria of non-development doesn't infringe on the question of the opening of the land and so on? So it seems to me like an enormous pedagogical project, but I don't think it can be conceived as pedagogical if it's not alter-economic. So we have to be able to think about capital. And in my experience, having worked really, really hard on an anti-capital financial platform, most people don't want to talk about capital in a pragmatic way. They want to talk about left-leaning politics, but when you get into the concrete of questions of finance, they don't think it's a left problem somehow, or there's an unease at that to talk about money. But we have to talk about money. I don't know how else we can do this if we don't talk about money. And that's been a sticking point.
Yeah.
See that Nikki has a hand up as well. So Nikki, do you want to enter into the conversation here?
Well, am I on mute? I can't even see myself here. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Yes.
No, we hear you.
Oh, good. So it's interesting listening to you talk, Judy, saying that you just want to run back to the university. And I'm sitting here thinking, well, actually, I want to run away from it, because I'm speaking as a teacher, as a lecturer of beginner students. And I think it's a question that Viv raised earlier, is that there's and Erin, what you were saying about pushback, because there's in terms of trying to open up spaces and do things differently in the classroom, actually the university is not really, or certainly from my experience, isn't really that flexible. And so then what is our responsibility to students, by especially beginner students, where you kind of, I feel like all these, is it ethical to well, I'm always in this, have this dilemma of whether by opening it up, then perhaps they might have to kind of close it down as they progress to higher levels of study. That's the one thing that's going through my mind. And then the other is, as a student myself, trying to finish off a doctoral project that's trying to do things differently, I find myself more and more conforming to the form that is required of me. So yeah, maybe it's better to go and live in the wild and not have to deal with any of the stuff. So yeah, it's not a question, or maybe it is a question. I don't know what it is. I'm befuddled by this.
aren't we all befuddled by this? Because we know that, I mean, the irony in all of this, I think, is that even just at the level of capital, innovation is at the forefront. So if we reduce our thinkers to formats and methods and frames, even from the perspective of capital, it's a bad idea, because the whole point is that the world is changing all the time. So you're framing something that fits with the past rather than working with the future. So I don't think, want to give in to that conversation about capital, because we know where that leads. But that's what I meant when I said the university is in ruins, that it doesn't even make sense to hold people back. Why wouldn't we decide that at this point in time, we need people to explode all the ways of learning so that we can learn together what the new learning looks like? But I think that that's a threat, precisely because what the university wants to do is to hold on to a certain notion of value. It wants to hold on to a certain notion of contouring knowledge, right? It's really, really threatening when a student comes to us and says, I don't think I need to learn that. I really don't think it's relevant to me. Why should I read Heidegger? I don't want to read Heidegger. And then you want to say to them, yeah, but it's good to read Heidegger. Well, maybe not, but you know what I mean. And so I think that what scares me is this, that I can sit there and say, yeah, you don't have to recognize the method. You can go beyond it. Or, yesterday I read a piece where Fred Moten and Stefano Harney were in conversation with a book on form, and they were saying, we just need a farm. We need to move to a farm and to other ways of doing. But Fred Moten is also somebody who has the privilege of exploring things in other ways. But what we know is that the people that we're teaching don't have that privilege. So how can we live with that as teachers? How can we possibly feel okay with that? I have no clue. I don't know. And so what happens, Nikki, is that my students don't adhere to the rules, and then they don't get jobs, right? And some of them get jobs, but most of the time, by the time they finish, they don't want to have anything to do with the university. So they begin to invent other things, and that's sad too, because they're the pedagogues that we need. So I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do except to keep reminding ourselves that we are the people who set up those constraints. It's us. It's not somebody out there. We're the ones reading the journal articles when they come our way. We're the ones reading the book manuscripts, and we have to fight harder every single time we get them on our desk to not let that happen. It's the only thing I can think. But then if that burns us out and we can't do anything else, it's also a problem. But.
So Erin, I know we're at time. I wondered if you'd be open to one final question that came through in the Q&A box, because I know, our apologies that we got started a little later than we hoped. So are you okay with that question? Okay.
Of course.
And that came through. I'll read it out loud for us to hear. The whole school system is in ruins. Thank you for acknowledging children as our best philosophers, Erin. I could not agree more, and too often witness their willingness to be affected and engage with deeply ethical questions being undercut by schoolifying or codifying their perspectives. The early young children learn to parrot facts about known structured white neurotypical world, the sooner their status is elevated in society. Can you say more about the consequences of and/or breaking with internalized modes of evaluation or the terror of not knowing? I see it show up in some educators I work with, and wherein there seems to be a fear by some early childhood educators to engage in the unknown or with philosophical text, and yet every day we expect children to learn new words, new concepts, etc. I'd love to hear more about pedagogical experimentation and breaking the cycle of disciplining minds into neurotypicality. Art-based approaches feel important. So what might you say in response to that comment and questions?
Well, clearly I have to learn from this person. I think of one thing that might be good to think about, because honestly, I'm not going to have more answers than anybody else who's doing this work. We're doing this work together. We really are doing this work together. But there was one time I was learning with folks from Norway, and I've learned so much from early childhood educators in Scandinavia. I've been lucky to be around some of them a few times. And we set up the classroom with some play, I guess, with some fabric and some thread and so on. And one of the early childhood educators in the room said, "Oh, this is familiar to me. We do this with the children." And I thought, oh, that's a problem. You don't do this with the children. You have to do this with each other. Like in the moment where we think that the work is for the children, we've stopped doing the work. And I'm not saying this person wasn't doing the work. I'm just saying that at some level, they'd stopped thinking that they needed the conditions for neurodiversity as much as the children needed the conditions for neurodiversity. Children they're not going to be tricked by us. They know when the conditions are there, and they know when we're imposing them, and so I think we have to always ask ourselves, what have we just imposed? Like right now, over an hour and a half, we've imposed conditions that are very singular, right? That have to do with sitting in one place, that have to do with talking, that have to do with watching, but we've allowed for some deviation. Some people didn't want to be in the front. Some people didn't want their images on. Some people maybe wanted just the recording. And so there's a kind of variety. But this question of that variety has to be at the forefront all the time, which is to say that I think that for me, the thing that I think about the most is attunement. How do I enter into an environment with the best conditions for attunement? And that means trying as hard as I can to be well prepared without having a schema to follow. So in a way to be prepared, but open enough. So perhaps as you do when I am also somebody who's very trained in improvisation, but there is that kind of quality of constraint, because if you don't have constraint, you'll return to common denominators. So setting up a constraint, but also allowing the constraint to be enabling of something it doesn't yet know how to enable. And then recognizing when you fail and speaking about that failure as often as you can, rather than internalizing a kind of shame around that failure. You're going to return to whiteness, you're going to return to neurotypicality, even if you're not white and even if you're not neurotypical, because those forms of expression and knowing are so ingrained in education systems that it's going to be inevitable you know, that you're going to say something like, I know we're tired, but just one more thing. And then you're like, oh, fuck. Not one more thing, right? So anyway, that's how I would say it. But I think we have to learn together how to do it.
Thanks, Erin. So I want to honor the time that people have here today, and maybe Viv and Geert, you two could close us off today as we end the webinar.
We've gone 5 minutes over, which isn't too bad. But I just wanted to say thank you so much, Erin. It's been such a wide-ranging, enlivening discussion. I've loved it. And I also have very much liked that people have felt free to jump in, and that we've seen people, and that it's been more of a conversation, those who felt that they could do that. So that's also been very special. So thanks, Candace, for making that possible. And yeah, thank you for starting off our series. I hope the others are going to be as interesting as this, and that it'll be a good series. So yeah, thank you very much to all involved. Geert, would you just like to end off by?
Just want to say thank you from the Belgian side. That's one thing. Two, I think you said some very, very important elements. You brought some very important elements on the table. Attunement, I was almost waiting for it, because I think this is something you can't organize, it's all uncertainty, but it's the super sensitive way of entering a social space and giving respect to people. And I think that is what gentle anarchists are doing. And I would love to call you a gentle anarchist, Erin. Thank you for all the things you are bringing this afternoon.
Thank you. Well, I look forward to being in the audience for the next ones.
Yes, and speaking of the next one, just want to announce it's on November 18th with Peter Smagorinsky. So please feel free to check our website. We'll make sure that there's no passcodes needed to get into the Zoom meeting. And we look forward to gathering again next month. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you for those questions. Thank you.